Last week we studied Antioch of Epiphanes, right? Antioch Epiphanes. And he was the sort of like the foreshadow of the Antichrist. You remember that? Okay. And the feast was the Feast of Dedication, which is Hanukkah. Hanukkah means dedication. Okay? So it was, the reason they call it Hanukkah was because they were rededicating the temple. Okay? But the issue was, the reason why they were rededicating the temple, and the big theme of the feast is the fact that Antioch Epiphanes wanted to annihilate and assimilate the Jewish people, right? Whatever he could whoever did not want to conform to the to the Greek culture, he wanted to annihilate. Anybody that would conform to the Greek culture, that would actually erase the Jewish people from the face of the earth, right? So the enemy's tactics in this case were assimilate and annihilate. Well, it's always been those tactics. From the time that God took Moses up to Egypt and he brought Israel out of the land of Egypt. If you remember, even in the days of when Moses was born, okay, they had an edict that came out from the Pharaoh because he was so worried about the Israelites becoming so numerous that he said, I want you to kill all the firstborn sons of Israel. And that's how Moses ended up, in the Pharaoh's house, because his mom put him on the Nile and Pharaoh's daughter found him, right? So you see this through the ages. And you see this in a number of their feasts, right? The Feast of Passover is commemorating when Israel was taken out of slavery and delivered into the Promised Land. So it's deliverance. The Feast of Dedication is also about deliverance. The Feast of Purim is also about deliverance. So this is a minor feast in the Jewish holidays. It commemorates saving the Jewish people from a man named Haman, who we're going to study today. He was planning on having the Jews killed, wiped off of the face of the earth. Okay, his plans were foiled by a man named Mordecai. So these are the main characters in the story. We're gonna go through the book of Esther today. Who has read the book of Esther in the last 6 months? Good for you.
I just read it.
Did you? Okay, so we got 3 or 4 of you. Yeah, it's a great story, but, as with anything, if you haven't read it recently, some cobwebs are produced and you can't really recall all the details. We're going to do like a Cliff Notes version of the book of Esther today. We're going to go through every single chapter and touch on all the highlights, so it's going to be exciting. So, Mordecai, he was a cousin of an adopted daughter named Esther. She became the queen of Persia. Okay, and she also became, and he adopted her. Yeah, I said that. Okay, so he adopted Esther, who was his cousin. Her parents had all died, so she was an orphan. Okay, this took place in the Persian Empire. It's in the biblical book of Esther. It's referred to as the Megillah or Megillat Esther, okay? King Ahasuerus, he's presumed to be Artaxerxes of Persia, whose father would have been Xerxes I. Okay, if you remember last week, we talked about the movie The 300, right? Where Persia attacks Greece, okay? In that movie, that's Xerxes who's going into Greece and attacking them at the Battle of Thermopylae. That's this battle right here. However, this isn't 100%. Once again, it says presumed, and see the little star here. So note, some biblical commentators, especially in the 19th century, believe that this is actually referring to Xerxes, okay, the first. So we're not sure if it's Xerxes or Artaxerxes or even Artaxerxes II, okay, but it's in that time frame. Okay, it's right in the time frame of the zenith of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire has never been as large as it has been at this time, and if you remember from our Bible last week, we were talking about how the Persian Empire, it was, Daniel prophesied that it was going to be going to the east and to the west and to the north, and and then from the north was going to come Alexander the Great, and he was going to put them down. Well, there was a lot of tension between the Greeks and the Persians at this time, because Persia tried to overcome them, but they were not able to do it, because God had planned that eventually Greece would rule second after Persia. So Purim's celebrated annually according to the Hebrew calendar. For those of you who haven't been here, the Hebrew calendar is driven by a lunar cycle, so it's driven by the moon. It's every 30 days, whereas our calendar is driven by the sun. So therefore, their holidays are going to shift according to our holidays. You can't say it's always the 1st of September or something like that. That's why if you look on Hebrew calendars, Hebrew calendars are kind of like Easter. You always see them moving around, right? And Easter for us moves around, right? So it's celebrated on Adar, which is the last month of the Hebrew calendar. It's celebrated on the 14th. However, it's celebrated on the 15th for the cities that are walled cities, because we'll see in the book of Esther that the people of Shushan actually were delivered that day. So wasn't sure if I wanted to put that extra detail in there, but just in case, I know a lot of you guys might someday travel to Israel or Jerusalem, and I don't want you to say, hey, that Bible study teacher Don told me it was only celebrated on the 14th, and here it is the 15th. I guess he had it wrong. So.
I know that's not on my list.
Yeah, I know. I think that a lot of people want to travel to Jerusalem. So anyhow, it's the story of Purim in the Old Testament. So we're gonna, like I said, we're gonna highlight this pretty quickly. I think we can get through it in about 15 or 20 minutes. That's my goal. So we'll see. The book of Esther begins with a 6-month feast. That's a pretty long feast, isn't it? Mm-hmm. 6 months, 180 days, half a year. They were having a feast. So a 6-month feast given by King Xerxes, or whoever he is, the king. All right. And so and this is the Medo-Persian Empire, and all 127 provinces. And then it ends with a 7-day feast, which is in Shushan. All right. And there's a separate feast. There's a secondary feast that Queen Vashti, that's his queen, is having for the women. So the men are having their feast and the women are having their feast. Okay? So all these texts that you see that are in bold, they're straight out of the Bible. Okay, so that's how you know that they're actually being quoted from the Bible. Just wanted to give you that note. In the days when the king was sat on his throne, so this was approximately 483, the person's commentary that I chose to use to help out with this study, okay, assumes that this is Xerxes, okay, which is the rather than Artaxerxes, okay. So it was around 483. I already said this was in its heyday. It was also in Greece's day when they had the 79th Olympic Games. Persian Empire had covered all of these areas. Ezra had returned from Babylon to rebuild the temple. Nehemiah at this time was working on building the temple walls. Okay. So moving on. So the king, he demands that Vashti displays her beauty before the feast. So this happened after about 7 days of feasting. It's been 6 months, but now they're really heightened it up in 7 days. King's pretty happy with the wine, so he's drunk, right? And it's assumed here that maybe they got in an argument like, who's the most beautiful women in the empire, right? And so I got the most beautiful woman. It's Queen Vashti. So he commands that she has to appear before the drunken guests for them to behold her beauty. Queen Vashti refuses to appear. Now, I never really totally understood this, but I did this week. It appears, when you look at the text on this, that it says to bring Queen Vashti before the king wearing her royal crown. So I just always assumed she's wearing her royal crown in inclusion with the clothes that she's wearing. But most of the rabbis and the sages have not read it like that. They read it reading her, wearing her royal crown. That's it. There's some reason why she's not willing to display herself, whether it was they want to see her beauty. So it could have possibly been that they maybe kept veils over their faces and she had to pull the veil back. We're not exactly sure, but according to the Jewish rabbis, this was the situation. Then also they have another thing that seems somewhat fanciful, and that's the idea that she really had no problem with displaying her beauty, just wearing her royal crown. But right before that, God had smote her with leprosy, and she didn't want to be showing off her skin like that. Okay. This seems a little, like I said, a little speculative there too. So, but there was some reason, right? There was some type of an embarrassment about having to do this, right? So the banishment of Vashti. Vashti was supposed to, so he decided, okay, that's it. Then she's not going to be queen anymore. And this is a terrible thing, because if you're banished from being queen, you don't just go back to your regular life. Okay, now you go back into the harem as being like one of the king's harem. And not only that, the king's never going to be with you. So as far as like any type of relationship with a man or anything like that, that's it. It's over. So, you know, you're like a widow for the rest of your life. So, and this Xerxes, if you read on down here, it's kind of interesting, because he had a bridge built at one time that an ocean storm destroyed. And so he was so mad at the ocean that he told his soldiers to go down there and take these things and to beat the water to punish the ocean, you know. And then he put a chain on it to punish it, you know, the sea. So, you know, he had his anger. You didn't want to like enthusiastically get his, he wasn't very logical once he got very mad, okay? But he thought he was a god, so he was punishing the sea, right? So, but then all of his councils got together and they said, you know what? We can't have women in our kingdom doing this. Look at Vashti. She's a role model for all the other women. You got to put her away. So that's when so that every man can be master of their own house. So that's why they put her away. So then once they put away the queen, they had to have a search for a new queen, right? So now they decided to have basically, you know, Miss Persia, right? We have Miss America, they have Miss Persia, okay? They had Miss Persia, and the winner of Miss Persia was going to be the king's wife and become queen. The loser, however, would be one of the other 399 that would go in to become part of his concubine or part of the harem. So not winning was really, while you would live in pretty lush and plush conditions, you really couldn't have, you know, maybe what you might have wanted for your life. Okay? So, anyhow, so the king liked that idea. So going back to like Esther and her family, there was a certain Jew named Mordecai. They had stayed in the region of Babylon, even though they were allowed to return. Part of the reason was because Judah at that time was kind of considered like a wilderness and backwards, whereas Babylon was like the city. And Mordecai had brought up this young Jewish lady named Hadassah, and he's the uncle's daughter. And her original name was Myrtle, which has some prophetic symbolism to Jewish people, or to briars and thorns in the desert, depicting our Lord's forgiveness and acceptance. Okay. So the young woman, according to the Bible, she was lovely and beautiful. So Esther's taken into the king's harem, okay? She's one of the 400 that are in this beauty contest. She gets favored treatment from the person who's kind of running the beauty contest. He's the eunuch, okay? You put a eunuch in charge of the harem because, I'll just leave it at that, all right? So Esther is told to conceal her identity. She's told by Mordecai, she says, look, don't let your people know and don't let anybody know that you're Jewish. Okay? After 12 months of preparation, so he spent an entire year preparing these people to be able to go through the contest. Each woman has gone into the king, and Esther is then selected as the queen. Okay? She found favor in the sight of the eunuch. She also found favor in the sight of the king. The king selects her. You know, there's a lot of parallels to Esther when you think about it, and Joseph. You remember how he kept finding favor. Even when he was thrown in prison, he found favor. And then when he came before the Pharaoh, he found favor. And there's other people too in the Bible where God, when he puts that grace on you, you find favor, right? So she obtained favor in the sight of everybody who saw her. She obtained grace. The king, gave her grace. And it's pretty remarkable because you think about where she came from. She was a child of Jewish exiles. Both of her parents had died. She was raised by her cousin in a foreign land where it was hostile to Jewish people. She was taken by compulsion into the king's harem. She found favor everywhere she met, and eventually she became queen of the entire realm. What a story that is, going from rags to riches, right? So anyhow, in the meantime, Mordecai is also rising up in prominence, okay? And he once again tells Esther to conceal her Jewish identity. So he's sitting in the king's gates, which means that he had a lot of influence with people, right? Esther she is still told not to reveal her identity. Now, what's fascinating about the book of Esther is the book of Esther, God is never referred to or talked about throughout the entire book of Esther. But what's really interesting is that there's 5 different passages where there's an acrostic of Yahweh. The JHVH symbols in Hebrew that show hidden Yahweh. So there's several reasons why possibly God is not mentioned. One of the reasons might just be, hey, here's a lesson for you how God works behind the scenes in our lives. Maybe God planned it like that to begin with. Another good reason, though, is the fact that this book, once it was written, it was given out to everybody in all of the area of Persia. And so you would have been like publishing something to say, hey, worship God versus their Persian God. So that might have been possibly it. Anyhow, Mordecai hears about an assassination to kill the king, and he tells Queen Esther about the assassination, and then the assassination is aborted. And this was a real threat because eventually Xerxes was assassinated by this guy right here. I'm sorry, not by him, by his prime minister, and then Artaxerxes was placed on the throne. So those things did happen. So anyhow, so Haman comes into the picture. Okay, so here's Mordecai. He's at the gates. He gets to determine who, everybody coming in to see the king kind of stops by the gates and stops by Mordecai, right? So he's at the gates. Haman, he's the son of the Aggites. Okay, the Aggites are from the Amalekites, and the Amalekites are the sworn enemies of Israel. Okay, and we'll get into that, okay, because there's a long history of the Amalekites and Israel, okay? So that's where he comes from. So he has this hatred already of the Jewish people, all right? So every time he gets promoted to this position of being like the chief advisor, to the king, okay? Not Mordecai, but Haman. Haman's the top guy next to the king. He's his chief advisor, right? Everywhere he goes, everybody bows to him and shows him respect. But every time he passes by Mordecai refuses to bow. He just stands there or sits there, right? And it's driving him crazy. And the Bible says that, it really wasn't a problem with necessarily bowing or paying homage, because there's several passages that do show people bowing and paying homage. Not in the aspect of worshiping somebody as God, but just showing respect, okay? But according to this other commentator, Hugh, he says, no self-respecting Benjamite would bow before the descendant of an ancient Amalekite, the enemy of the Jews. So, by the way, Mordecai comes from the tribe of Benjamin. Put that in your file cabinet for a second, because we'll come back to that. So we have the Amalekites, right? And we have the Jews. Mordecai comes from the tribe of Benjamin. All right. So, Haman, his pride is wounded. He's so mad, okay, He's so mad, he not only wants to destroy Mordecai, but he wants to take all of the Jews off the face of the earth, which really kind of shows his predisposition about how much he hates the Jews to begin with. Right? Haman determines the exact date that he's going to strike at the Jews. The way he did that was they took dice and they rolled these dice. It's called a Purim, which is why the feast is called the Feast of Purim. So they cast these lots. Purim means lots. They cast these lots. We assume maybe a dice or whatever. And somehow it came up with the month of Adar, which was like 11 months away. So it was a long time away. He had a lot of time to go ahead and put his plan into effect. Right? So Haman makes this proposal to the king. He says, hey, there's these certain people out there that aren't following your laws, king. We need to get rid of them. And the king's like, well, I can't have people not following my laws. And he says, on top of that, I will pay you 10,000 talents of silver, which is like a ton of money. So not only is the king like we can't have people not following my laws, but I'm going to be making a lot of money here too. So good deal. Well, nobody supposes that Haman had 10,000 talents of silver. He expected to get that wealth by killing the Jews and seizing all of their wealth. Which, by the way, is something that has continued to happen throughout history. And whenever people are persecuted, people or a democide has occurred, you've always taken their wealth. Okay? And so the Jews have seen this happen throughout history. So the king says, hey, this is a great idea. Let's go ahead and do this. So he signs a decree. It becomes official. They say to destroy and kill and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women, all in one day. They're all going to be wiped out. Okay? So the king and Haman, they sat down. They said, oh, this is good. Let's have a drink. But the people in the city of Shushan, they were perplexed because guess what? They have neighbors that are Jewish people, and they're like, why? What's the matter with this person? These people are okay, right? So he, by the way, Mordecai, okay, so Mordecai and the rest of the Jews, they begin to lament their fate, basically, in Esther chapter 4. And then Mordecai says, you know what, I'm going to have to talk to Esther about this. She's the queen of Persia. Maybe she can do something, right? She has the king's ear. So he goes up to Esther and he says, look, everybody's going to be put to death. Is there something that you can do about it? And she doesn't really make any kind of a response to that. So Mordecai comes, gives her some time to think about it. He comes back a second time and he says, look, don't think that you're going to get away with this, Queen Esther, because it says all the Jews and you're Jew. Okay, so you're going to die too. Okay, and if you're silent, God's going to raise somebody else up, and that kind of shows Mordecai's faith. Because guess what? In the Old Testament, it says that God is going to keep the Jews on the earth. No matter how many times that people try to exterminate them, they will continue to have a presence. And you know what? I wanted to pull those passages up for you, and I didn't have them in the study. Maybe that's why I couldn't print it out this week. So maybe I'll have it in the printout next week. Anyhow, but he says, you and your father's house will perish. And he says, and maybe God put this whole thing together to raise you up into this position for times such as this. You're the queen of Persia. Look where you started from. So you need to go in there. So Esther says, well, she thinks about it. And she says, this isn't a small decision, okay? You think she's the queen, so she sees the king every day, right? That's not the way it works in Persia, okay? She sees the king once in a blue moon. And when I say blue moon, I mean like once every 6 months or year, or maybe even longer than that. She rarely sees the king, okay? And you do not go into the king's presence unless he calls for you. Because guess what happens? If he doesn't like seeing you that day, you die. Okay? So, she says, if I go into the king's presence, which is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. She says, you know what? I'm going to do this because it needs to be done. So she garners up the strength and the courage, and she decides she's going to do this. So then Esther, she shows up in front of the king. She gets dressed up in all of her royal garments. And when the king sees her, he says to her, what is it that you're here for? And he does receive her. So he happy there. He didn't decide to kill her, right? He says, what could be granted to you? I'll give you up to half of the kingdom. You guys think about this. That same phrase is used in the New Testament when John the Baptist's head was requested, if you remember, right? It doesn't literally mean half of the kingdom. It's a proverb that means like pretty much anything you ask for, I will give you. Okay, so don't take that literally. It's a proverb. Anyhow, so she says she can't. It appears that she doesn't have enough courage at this time, because guess what? She's going to say Haman here tricked you into putting together this thing to kill all the Jews, and yet Haman's his right-hand man, so this could go real bad, right? So she doesn't have the courage quite yet to bring this up to the king. So she says, you know what, why don't you guys come to a feast again for tomorrow, and I'll let you know. So it's put off for a day. Well, in the meantime, Haman, he passes by Mordecai again, and Mordecai doesn't stand up again. It's driving him crazy. And here's Mordecai. He says, man, I have great riches, and I have all these children, and everything the king has done for me. He's promoted me above everybody else. And besides that, the queen's having this banquet, and only me and the king are invited. That's how important I am. But if Mordecai doesn't bow down before me, I don't have anything. Wow. It's amazing how incensed we can become once those little foxes get into our brain. So Haman happily receives counsel from some of his people. They say, hey, you know what? Why don't you build a gallows, okay, 50 cubits high, that's 75 feet high, and then kill Mordecai on it, have him hanged on it, okay? Well, most people don't believe that they actually meant hanged, because they didn't, when they were putting people to death through execution back in the Persian days, they weren't hanging them, okay, when you were making a public spectacle out of them, okay? What they were doing is they were impaling them on a stake, okay? So he said, make this thing 75 feet up in the air and put him up there and impale him on a stake so that everyone can see that you don't do this. Well, so that was the day before. So during that night, he has the gallows built. The next day, he's going to be meeting with Queen Esther and the king. But that night, for some reason, the king can't go to sleep that night. Almost like in the book of Daniel. Remember the book of Daniel? The king couldn't sleep that night either. Well, he could have all kinds of things that he could decide to do. You know, bring in my harem of women for me, or, you know, bring in some wine, or bring in some food, you know, so I can eat something and maybe get tired. He says, you know what, bring in the book of Chronicles, which are basically all the things that's, you know, he's done great in his kingdom, and read them to me. I want to hear about how great I am, right? So they bring in the book of Chronicles. Well, when they bring in the book of Chronicles, they read over the thing that Mordecai had done in regards to saving the king's life. And the king says, wait a second. He says, what has been done what has been done for honor or dignity to put on that Mordecai has done this? Have we done anything for him? And they're like, no, you haven't done anything for him. He's like, well, okay, well then we're going to have to do something. So the king, the next morning, Haman's like, can't wait to see the king, because he's like, you know what, the first thing I'm going to do, as soon as I see the king, I'm going to say, hey, I want to kill Mordecai, I want to put him up on my gallows, because he won't bow down before me, right? But the king, in the meantime, the first thing he's going to say, because he's thinking to himself, it's like, you know what, here comes Haman, my advisor. Hey, Haman, he says to him, what shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? So he doesn't get a chance to say anything about Mordecai. He's just getting ready to say it. Mordecai. And here comes the king. He says, what can we do for this man I want to honor? And Mordecai says, oh, let a royal robe be brought out, and which the king has worn, and a horse which the king has ridden, and a royal crest pasted on his head, and let the robe and the horse be delivered to the hand of the one of the king's most noble princes, that he may array the man the king's delights to honor, and then parade him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim him before him. So the king says, hey, great idea, Mordecai. Haman, you do all this stuff for Mordecai. And everything that you said, don't let one thing be left undone. Do it exactly the way you said it. Well, immediately, Haman says, right after he does this, okay, he covers his head and he runs to his house. His wife, his family, his advisors, they could all say, hey, you're not going to prevail against Mordecai. He's going to prevail against you. This is not looking good for you right now, Haman. This is a bad place that you're in, right? So then Haman has to show up at this second banquet, right? So at the second banquet, Esther finally says, okay, I'm going to tell you what. Here's what I'm asking for. Let my life be given to me at my petition and the people at my request. What she's saying is, she says, my petition is for my life because I'm going to die in this. And so will my people. And the king is like, well, what are you talking about? And that's when he says, who's this wicked person? The king says the word wicked first, by the way. He says, who's this wicked person who put all this together? And then when Queen answers, she says, the adversary and the enemy is this wicked Haman. And she points right at him. There he is, right there, this wicked Haman. And Esther exposed the truth about Haman. And then the king arose in his wrath. And he kind of walks out of the room. He's furious because he realizes he's been duped by Haman. First of all, when Haman talked about like these scattered, dispersed people, it didn't sound like that many people probably when you thought about it, right? So he was like, oh yeah, they're probably a group of rebels. Yeah, have them killed. But this was a lot of people. This was the entire race of the Jewish people throughout his empire. And I don't think that he would have agreed to that if Haman had been a little more forthcoming. So anyhow, in the meantime, while he walks out of the house, Haman's pleading for his life with Esther, and he falls on the couch, laying next to her, pleads for her, and he falls like on her. And as soon as he falls on her, the king comes in, and he says, are you going to assault the queen also while you're in my house? Even in his pleading, he's not going to get out of this situation. So, the next thing you know, one of the king's eunuchs says, hey, look, the gallows, because they're up 75 feet. You can see them from just about anywhere. Look, the gallows that Haman had made for Mordecai. Let's use them to put Haman on them. So Haman is then executed on the gallows in the way that I had mentioned. And then the king gives Haman's home, which was probably pretty elaborate, to Esther, and he gives his position to Mordecai. So Mordecai becomes the chief advisor now to the king. Then Esther said, hey, you know what, king, let's go ahead and revoke this edict that you put out there, so that my people can be saved. Because I'm saved, you saved me, but what about my people, right? And the king says, I can't do that. Because it was a law, according to the Medes and Persians, that once you wrote it down and you said that this is the rule of law, that was it. You couldn't change it. Even being the king, you couldn't change it. We find something very similar with our God. Our God, esteems his word even higher than his name, right? Well, what ended up happening was the king, instead of erasing that decree, he made a counter decree that the Jews would be allowed to protect themselves in the day of annihilation. And what ended up happening is that on the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, and the Jews had destroyed them. So a lot of people, they decided not to try to destroy the Jews. Because why? Because there was a lot of people in Shushan, for example, that said, hey, that Jewish person, that's a good person. Why would I want to destroy him, right? Women and children and all that kind of stuff. But then there were those haters out there who wanted to destroy the Jewish people, like the Amalekites, right? So, victory with the help of the king. And then at the king's invitation, Esther was, this is kind of radical. Esther says, what about Haman's 10 sons? And the king says, yes, let's put them on the gallows too. So they were killed also. You do have to remember that in this time period that, there was blood revenge. So those 10 sons would have probably came back and with a vengeance. So Haman and his sons were descendants of the Amalekites. The Amalekites are the same Amalekites in Exodus. Did I get the verse in here? I don't think I did. In Exodus, that attacked the Jews during Exodus when Moses had to hold his hands up and they were winning the battle and then losing the battle. They also come from the line of Esau, by the way. So Samuel, so we got Saul, the first king. Samuel, the prophet, had anointed Saul, and he was told to wipe the Amalekites off of the face of the earth. This was prior to Esther, right? Well, he didn't. If you remember the story, he won the battle, but then he allowed them all to live, and he allowed the king to live, and everything else. So the Amalekites continued to live. Well, you know, the reason why God said wipe them off of the face of the earth was because guess what? Because their whole spirit was to wipe out the Jewish people. And we see that then in the book of Esther, right? Where it then reestablishes its head to once again try to wipe out the Jewish people. So in the book of Esther, the Feast of Purim was established. It's established in chapter 9, and it was sent out to all the Jews, and a decree was confirmed. So time frame historically is that Nehemiah was building the walls of Jerusalem, okay? And the people who wanted to attack Jerusalem were very upset about this. So there was this huge anti-Semitic, if you want to call it, attitude towards Jewish people. The reason why they were upset about the walls being fortified was because they were easy pickings before the walls were fortified, and it would be easy to knock them off the face of the earth. So there was that presence already. Here's some passages in the Old Testament that refer to Amalekite. And this is where, I'm sorry, it wasn't Exodus, it was Deuteronomy. It says, remember what well, it was Exodus. It was Exodus, the event I was talking about. But here's where God was talking in Deuteronomy. He says, remember what Amalekite did to thee by the way, when ye were come forth out of Egypt, how he met thee by the way, and smote the hindmost of thee, even all that were feeble and behind thee. In other words, the women and children and the elderly and the sick, they attacked the back of the line. That's what they did. And he says, thou shalt blot out the remembrance of Amalekite from under heaven. And they didn't do it. So here you have, these are the passages right here about Saul and the king of Agag. And if you remember when we were reading the book of Esther, Haman was a descendant of the king of Agag. So he was descended straight from that royal line of Agag. Isn't that fascinating? But guess what? Mordecai is descendant from Saul. The battle continues. A different generation. You know? Isn't that fascinating? I'm going to pass by those. Origin and the meaning of the name Esther. It means morning star. And yeah, and it's fascinating that the sages believe that Psalm 22 refers to Esther, because in Psalm 22, that's the psalm where Jesus said, Lord, Lord, why have you forsaken me? And he points to Psalm 22, and it's a very messianic psalm. So there is a messianic allusion here of how Esther foreshadows things that the Messiah would do. Now, the book of Esther is really excellent literature when you think about it. There's all this hidden stuff in there. There's the Yahweh acrostic. There's the idea of Purim being chance. Like, when is it going to happen, right? But everything seems to be playing out so precisely that there's no way chance could be involved. For example, we have by chance Queen Vashti defies the king, which sets off a search for a new queen. And by chance, you have this beautiful young woman that's being raised by Mordecai, and she wins the contest. And by chance, over the countless women. And by chance, Mordecai overhears a conspiracy. And by chance, Haman is promoted. And the list just goes on and on and on. And I'm not going to read them all out because we don't have time to do it. But it's an excellent faith-building piece for you to look through next week when I give you your notes, or if you decide to go onto our Facebook group and pull them down yourself. Also, there's all these duplications in the book of Esther, okay? Everything seems to happen in twos. You have two feasts, one for the man, one for the women. You have two lists of servants, two reports where Esther's supposed to hide her identity, two houses for the women, two gatherings of the women, two unscheduled appearances of Esther before the king, two feasts that she prepared for the king. Twice Haman covered his head. and 2 references to the deaths of Haman's sons. Modern echoes of Purim. This is really fascinating. On the date of Purim, in 1946, 10 of Hitler's top 10 the 10 of Hitler's top associates were killed by death, hanging. There was one of them, Julius Streicher, who had announced Purim Fest 1946. He understood the significance of that date. That's written in the Nazi war, the execution of the Nazi war criminals. 1953, Stalin was planning on deporting Jews from Soviet Union to Siberia. Just before his plans, he suffered and died stroke. It's a minor feast. The primary commandment is to read the book of Esther. So you guys just celebrated Purim, Cliff Notes version, okay? It's every time that Haman's name is mentioned in the book of Purim, okay, when they're reading it, everybody's supposed to boo or stomp their feet or make really a whole bunch of big noise, because they say that you got to blot out the name of Haman from underneath the earth, from underneath the earth. You're eating and drinking and being merry. Commandment is to send out gifts and food for charity, and it's customary to have carnival-like celebrations. In fact, many Americans call Purim the Jewish Mardi Gras. Jesus may have celebrated Purim in John chapter 5, which is called an unnamed feast. There's a lot of scholars that believe that that's Purim that he went to. So there's not much in the New Testament about it. Purim and Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur is also known as Yom Kippurim, which can be read as a day like Purim. Prophetic significance is that you have this spirit out through the ages that the rabbis have called the spirit of Haman. If you look at the spirit of Haman through the ages, I had a long list I've been contemplating all week, and I just ran out of time, but Jacob and Esau, the Egyptian persecution, the Greeks under Antioch Epiphanes, the Roman destruction of the empire, and you see the Roman destruction of the temple, and when you see when Nero destroyed the temple, you see all of these incredible calamities that befell Rome. And you have Russia, Nazi Germany, the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Six-Day War in 1967. You know, the fact that we have a Jewish population that is even on the earth nowadays is astounding, because no race of people, once they've been assimilated into a culture, has continued to keep their identity. And the Jewish people have been dispersed for over 2,000 years. Mm-hmm. Yet they've continued to keep their identity. The fact that there is an Israel today should tell you there's a God, because God said he would bring them back to the land of Israel. Satan's idea was, I need to destroy these people and assimilate these people, but God kept them in his hand and brought them back to the land of Israel. Here's some interesting stuff is here. Check this out. October the 30th, President Bush signed the Oslo Peace Accord for Land for Peace. A perfect storm hit New England and destroyed his house. August the 23rd, they did the same thing, Land for Peace, and you had Hurricane Andrew hit Florida. All kinds of situations there, and the deal is that if you look at this verse here, it says, on that day when all the nations of the earth would be gathered against her. And it's talking about the war, but it also talks about an attitude, and that's the attitude of the United Nations. If you ever watch the United Nations, they vote almost every single country except for the United States against Israel. Every time a resolution is brought, okay? Every country votes against Israel. I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock for all the nations, and all who try to move it will injure themselves. By the way, rocks in the Old Testament were used to mark your land. So it's interesting that every time that we're talking about things that are happening with the United States, it's all about the land. And here's a little depiction right here about just kind of showing that Israel just only became a nation for one day, and they were attacked on every single side by millions of Arabs, and yet they survived.
And it's not a large country.
It isn't. So the spirit of Haman continues through the ages. It was in Hitler's final solution. It's something that Satan's wanted to do. And what happens at the end of days? The end of days, all the armies of the world are going to march on where? Jerusalem. Right? Spirit of Haman, the Antichrist. So, any questions or comments?